Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to rise today to speak in support of the NDP Opposition Day motion in the names of the members of Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie and the member for Edmonton Strathcona. This is a motion which sets out a clear path for Canada to walk the walk of a climate leader. For more than a decade, I've been advocating for a rapid transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. I have consistently opposed further investment in fossil fuels, and especially in investments that would result in an increase in tanker traffic on BC's coast. My opposition to increased tanker traffic, as many people know, dates back to when I was first elected to Esquimalt Council in 2008, and I went to my first emergency preparedness meeting as a councillor and found we had no plan and no resources for an oil spill on our beaches. I moved a motion in council then to oppose an increase in tanker traffic, and that motion was unanimously adopted by my council and later by the Union of BC Municipalities, because municipalities understood that the lack of a plan to even deal with the current tanker traffic meant we couldn't afford the risk of a 7 times increase in tanker traffic, which would come with the Kinder Morgan pipeline. This increase in tanker traffic presents a threat to the environment on our pristine coast and our already stressed ecosystems, but it presents a particular threat to the 76 southern resident killer whales. These orcas, even the National Energy Board admitted, will probably be extinct if the Kinder Morgan project goes ahead, although the National Energy Board said it wasn't in their jurisdiction, of course, to look at that question. But also, an increase in tanker traffic threatens the existing economy in my riding, where fishing, both recreational and sport fishing, and tourism are the backbone of the private sector. No one comes to Vancouver Island to see oil spills. They come to enjoy the pristine beaches, the coastline, to fish, and to see the iconic southern resident killer whales. A 700% increase in tanker traffic means a 700% increase in the likelihood of a spill. So even if the current risks are fairly low, we know that a spill will eventually take place. Even Kinder Morgan admitted that in its submission to the National Energy Board. When the government says we have world-class measures in place, it's important to talk about what they mean by world-class measures to deal with spills. And so, as a newly elected MP in 2011, I talked to the Chief Operating Officer of Western Canada Marine Response Corporation. That's the oil and pipeline-owned nonprofit responsible for spills. And of course, there's a little irony there when oil and pipeline companies own the company responsible for cleaning up the spills. But I digress. I asked him, what are the standards? What are the standards for successful cleanup of a spill? And he said it's a 10 to 15% cleanup of the actual oil spilled and a response time of 6 to 6.5 hours for my riding. Now, I asked him, is that because that's what science says is necessary? Or is that because that 15% cleanup and that 6-hour response time is what would best limit the impacts in my riding? No, he said, it's the best we can do, and so that's the standard. And this was the standard for cleaning up crude oil spills, not bitumen, which sinks, not floats. As for the Liberals' vaunted $1.5 billion oceans protection plan, well, let's do the math. $1.5 billion over 10 years, so now we're down to $150 million per year, divided by 3 oceans. And let's say the North is cheated as usual and only gets $30 million of that. Then that leaves about $60 million a year for each coast. Really? $60 million a year for each coast to improve our oil spill response capacity when we're going to have a 7 times increase in tanker traffic? And of course, the Ocean Protection Plan really isn't a plan. It's more a wish list, most of which consists of additional consultation and replacement of badly outdated equipment that is already needed on the coast. Now, before the other side starts accusing me of hypocrisy or callousness to existing oil workers, or being a big spender for taking these actions, let me say 3 things about that before my honourable friends get started. First, I'll say personal actions are necessary for all of us, from all of us, to meet the challenges of climate change. I do make best efforts personally, as those of us who are privileged can do. I have been driving an electric car for more than 5 years. We have a heat pump and energy-efficient appliances at our home, and I do buy carbon offsets for my flying as an MP. But individual action, however necessary, will never be sufficient to meet the challenges of climate change. And most Canadians lack the resources to make the changes in their lifestyle. And even if they were able to make those changes, they wouldn't be enough without collective action. Second, I would say, I have never suggested that an immediate shutdown of the oil sands is the solution. But I have called for a moratorium on expansion of the oil sands because we have to stop rushing headlong in the wrong direction. Third, the question here of jobs is not one of making people unemployed. It's making sure that they have high-quality, family-supporting, sustainable jobs in the long term. Renewable technologies already exist. These technologies are proven and economic. In fact, as of this year, there are more jobs in Canada already in the existing renewable energy industry than in the entire oil and gas industry. Investment in renewable energy creates jobs in every community, not just in remote camps. And these are skilled jobs, long-term jobs, not sunset jobs. And if we talk about how much these jobs cost, it's very clear. Oil and gas investments per $1 million produce about one full-time job. Renewables do far better. Solar projects, just to take one example, generate more than 6 jobs for every $1 million invested. So if we're going to just make a straight economic argument where to invest for jobs, family-supporting, high-skilled jobs in the future, it's in renewable energy. It's not in oil and gas. And in some of the sectors of renewable energy, the very skills that have been used in oil and gas are transferable. The best example of that is geothermal, mostly used for space heating and mostly totally underutilized in Canada. But this is the best example because geothermal projects need civil and geological engineers. They need drillers, they need pipe fitters, they need welders. And these are exactly the skills directly transferable from the oil and gas industry. What we need is the support from government to get started on that transition for those workers. Finally, I'm often challenged on how to explain how we're actually going to pay for this necessary transition. And let's be clear that we must pay to act quickly or we will face catastrophic consequences and costs in trying to cope with climate change and perhaps even risk our future on this planet. So, how do we pay? We could start by ending the federal subsidy on fossil fuels, estimated at near $3.3 billion per year. Now, this is something that both the Liberals and the NDP promised in the last election. Just a little difference in the timing. Immediately for us, and by 2025 for the Liberals. And it's also interesting that a recent report from the Auditor General found that despite that promise, he could find no plan to phase out these subsidies, let alone any evidence the government had started to do so. So there's $3.3 billion per year that we're putting into the old technology and into the climate-threatening technology in oil and gas. Now, in addition to that, I'm arguing, as I always have, that we should back away from wrong-headed decisions like buying out Kinder Morgan. Buying the old pipeline for $4.5 billion and then spending another $7 to $10 billion on its replacement is squandering up to $15 billion when you combine that with the subsidies that we could eliminate. This would give us an investment fund for renewable energy of over $10 billion in the first year, with another $3.3 billion available annually with the end of those subsidies. That's a lot of money to put into a solid, renewable energy future and into jobs everywhere in every country across this country, in every community across this country. Now, the government's telling us that the investment in Kinder Morgan is only temporary and the pipeline will be sold once it's been, quote-unquote, de-risked. However, there was no private sector buyer for this pipeline when this guarantee from the government against delays was already in place. So it's hard to figure out who that future buyer would be unless the Liberals plan on taking a big loss on behalf of the public. And it's not clear yet from this government how they intend to pay for this big investment, both for buying Kinder Morgan and for building the new pipeline. There was no, obviously, provision in the last budget to do this, so where are they going to find that money? Very hard to figure that out. So it's very easy for some to try and blame the Horgan government for delay, easy perhaps rhetorically, but harder to make that case in reality. No permits applied for in British Columbia have been denied. And going to court to protect the provincial jurisdiction makes sense because the BC Supreme Court ruled in the Northern Gateway case that, in fact, the province had to do its own environmental assessment of that pipeline. So how could that be the case if there is no provincial jurisdiction? So we face some stark choices ahead. We can continue down the path of investing in fossil fuels, and we can continue to have increasingly harsh impacts of climate change that threaten all our jobs and all our families. Or we can choose a path to a low-carbon economy, one which creates good family-supporting jobs, sustainable jobs in all provinces and all communities, and one which avoids the looming catastrophe of climate change that will come with missing our Paris targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and that will come with the inevitable temperature increase beyond 2 degrees. I call for us to take that more progressive path. Thank you, Madam Speaker.